It is.
So how did you get started painting? Like, how long have you been working at your art?
I guess it's over 30 years now. But I always was a person who painted. Like when I was in grade school or high school, if someone wanted a poster for some upcoming event, I'd be the first one there with the crayons or the markers or the poster paint. And I was always that kid. So that was always there. When I worked as a hairstylist, I think for a number of years because I always wanted to do something that was in the creative field. I didn't think, I'm a very practical person, and I didn't think I'd be able to make a living as an artist. So I thought, how can I, use this thing that I have and make a living? So I did that. But while I was doing that, I was still painting. I was still educating myself. I was taking a degree through Memorial in education. I ended up teaching at Kona for a little while. And all through this, I was still painting, but just on a very, weekend type basis, I would call it. And then I got pregnant. And I wanted to kind of spend more time with, take it a little slower, not be working all the time. So that's what was the impetus. And I thought, I'm going to try this and see if I can at least establish a part-time job while I can, have the pregnancy and then have a little baby, be able to stay home. And my daughter was born in 1991, and everything was happening. I finished my degree I'd been working on for a long, long time, part-time, in 1994. And all through that stretch, I started to establish a business. I registered it, I think, it was between there, so it might have been 1992 or 3. I registered it as an official business and became, one of the home-based businesses here in Gander, and never looked back. And I did everything. I wasn't just painting. I did framing. I did art lessons for kids aged 10 to 16, anything and everything that I thought that I could sort of tie into this to make it a viable operation. I did it all. So that's how it all started, and that's been on the go for a long time.
But eventually, right now, it's painting, right? You do your paintings and art. That's what it's evolved to.
It has. Yes, I still teach in that I've been offering paint nights. Throughout this past year. That's something new for me. And we do that down at Thingamajiggers, and usually on Saturday evenings. I've maybe done half a dozen or so, and I plan to do another half a dozen or so this year. And it's a paint night. I don't call it a party because I'm kind of serious about what I do. And so when people come to the paint night, it's very much like a class as opposed to a party. Yes, you can still have a glass of wine if you want, but it's I like to impart some knowledge and, so that the participants who come get something out of it. So I'm still teaching in that way. Framing, I do very little. I still do matting for myself, all of my own things that I sell, 8x10s or things like that, foam core that I cut out for prints that I'm selling. I still have a room in my basement that's dedicated to framing, but I've pretty well stepped back from anything with glass, so it's not as dangerous and not as heavy. But I still do a tremendous amount of matting because I sell a lot of matted 8x10s. That's a big part of my retail. And so I still do that. But painting is number one, and of course for children's books, I do more painting for children's books than I do for any other painting I do put together.
Right, because a lot of paintings, it's a collection of paintings. Your children's books are
exactly
fully illustrated. Yeah. So if you've got every page or so with a painting, a different illustration on it, then that's a painting in and of itself, which is fantastic. And we will talk about your books a little bit, but
sure.
I want to talk about. So, what kind of paints do you use? Do you use acrylic? Is that your?
I started with oil. I did art lessons many years ago when I first moved to Gander, because I moved here when I was a teenager with my family. And one of the first things I did was sign up for lessons with Gilbert Manuel. It's like I said, this has been a lifelong thing for me. I can't remember when I didn't paint and draw. It's always been part of me. But Gilbert, who's a fabulous artist here in Gander, he was really involved in giving art lessons at that time. So I signed up, and I took some art lessons from him, and he was an oil painter, and he wanted to pass that skill along, so I started with oil, and then I joined the Gander Brush and Palette Club back in, oh my, 1980 maybe, I don't know, a long time ago. They let me in a little early. It was an adult group. You were supposed to be 18, but they let me in a little early because they knew how much I wanted to join. And they were primarily oil painters. People like Isabel Blackmore and Jean Seward, excellent artists. Barbara Chapman, who lived here for a while, she moved away. She was fantastic and still is a fantastic artist. So I worked with, we met every Wednesday night from the fall till the spring. And they were all oil painters. So oil was what I started with. But unfortunately, I'm asthmatic. And that became a bit of a problem because oil paint, even if you use odorless paint thinners and odorless medium and whatever, it's still, the paint itself is fairly, I won't say it's toxic, but it does have, components in it that are not great for asthma. So I've gradually weaned myself off of oil and more so into watercolor. Acrylic has not been my favorite medium. When you have worked with oil for a really long time, and oil is so movable, you can push the paint around the canvas. I think that's a phrase that Julia Picard used to use a lot, but you can push the paint around the canvas for days before it will dry to the point where you can't move it very much. Whereas with acrylic, it dries so quickly that you don't have that same flexibility. You have to be more sure about where you're putting your brush and why you're putting it where you are, because you can't change your mind so easily. So with acrylic, I do paint with acrylic, but I still find that a little challenging. Watercolor, I just love the softness in the colors, and I love the sort of unpredictability about it. If you're doing a sky, you can pre-wet your paper, and you can start and dark around the top and light it towards the horizon and follow all the rules. But it's never going to turn out exactly the way you think it is because it's water paint, and there's no controlling it. It's going to do things that you didn't expect. But it's kind of fun to learn how to roll with that and let what happens be. And, I've really, in the last number of years, watercolor has really been my saving grace. I love watercolor. And that's been what I've been using pretty much exclusively for about the last 5 years.
I had no idea. Now, that's interesting. Watercolor to me, okay, so I paint very little. It's a hobby.
But you've shown me some, Carolyn, and you are much better artist than you give yourself credit for.
Well, I think I'm an amateur. Like I still have that. Like I sat down one day with a paper and just practiced drawing rocks, which is very important skill if you live in Newfoundland and you want to paint the landscape.
Yep, it is. And rocks are not easy.
What's funny about that is I turn like rocks and water, and I just practice. And my daughter absolutely loves that painting. It's sitting in the corner. She won't let me because I just like it was a practice thing. And she's like, no, this is like I really like this one. I'm like, but I work so much harder on all the others. But But
the freedom, she recognizes the freedom that you felt when you did that. That's the thing about it. When you can be loose and free and you work on it and you're not thinking, okay, I have to have this look a certain way when it's finished. That's the appeal, I'm sure. I'd love to see that one. I bet I would love it too.
It's yeah. Well, see, that's the thing, and it's so funny because I was the kid like you that grew up, and I was the one who made the posters and did all of that, and could
Right.
draw, okay and
Yep.
passable, and people could
Yep.
recognize what I drew, and
Exactly.
but I never went
Exactly.
into it as like you didn't see it as a potential. Didn't see the arts at all as having any potential to make a living, which is ridiculous. Now I see the opposite. I think that
Yes.
we're missing some opportunities there that we should be exploring, because I think there's tons of opportunities in the arts. But
Oh, absolutely.
and we'll get to that later. But
Sure.
I've painted off and on, like gone to a lesson here and there, like just,
Right.
and really did not like it was fun.
Yes.
Found it a little frustrating because it never did oil, just acrylic,
Right.
and found that it would dry too fast. It didn't come out the way I wanted, and it was a little frustrating.
No.
But it was fun.
Yes.
And then I went to a water paint class just last
Right.
year,
Right.
and I will be frank, the class wasn't great.
Okay.
It was not great.
Yeah.
The instructor was not like water paint is a very specific sort of, you wet the paper. There's a lot of
Yes.
things you have to do,
Steps.
and
Yeah.
I wasn't getting what's the method.
No.
Like how is this working?
Right.
It's just not working for me. It's nothing to do it.
Right.
And then one of the other people had actually done watercolors before, and she
Right.
basically said, "Oh, you're not painting with the paint. You're painting with the water."
Exactly.
And I went,
Yeah.
oh, that's totally different. I could do that. So you're basically
Yeah.
putting color into water. And so from that time on, I have bought an easel. I have invested in water paper, the proper
wonderful.
paper, really heavy bond. It's a nice quality.
Expensive stuff, I know.
I've got water paints that I bought online. I've got a whole nice set of 2 sets actually of brushes. I've got and I do dabble a little bit in the water paints. I get
Right.
lost in it.
I know.
I love if you're a Newfoundlander and you look at the sky,
Exactly.
and it changes, and the sunsets and the sunrises, and how the colors flow, and it's just like really dramatic. And I find with water paint you can do that, and that variation that you can't control doesn't matter
Exactly.
because it's the same. Because it could be the sky on a given
what?
day.
What a perfect way of describing it. That's perfect because that's exactly right. The unexpected and the movement. Because with oil or acrylic, you'd be planning it out.
Right.
You'd be planning every little thing. But with water, in most cases with a sky, I'll wet the entire area that I'm going to be doing the sky, and then I'll just sort of add the paint colors, the water paint here and there where roughly I want it, and then I'll just let the water move. Let it take it where it's going. And sometimes I'll even lift up I always work with my paper taped down to a rigid surface, but sometimes it's a piece of plywood, and but I'll lift it up and I'll move it. I will tilt it one way or another, and the water will move and take it, and the way that it bleeds together, and blends together, is something that if you sat down and tried to duplicate that on purpose, you'd never get it.
No,
and that's the beauty of watercolor. I mean, that's
what I like
beauty
about
of
it.
Well, good for you.
Yeah, I really love. Also, the expectation is different. Nobody expects it to be exact.
No.
Do you know what I mean? It's never going to look like a photograph. That aspect doesn't happen in watercolor. And so what I did when I started painting with watercolors, I'm like, I really like this.
Yes.
I went online and I started looking at watercolor artists, looking at their work, and I went, this is amazing. Like, they make it look, I don't know, it's a different lens. You're not.
It is.
It's totally different to work with and to see.
Is.
And
yeah,
so
it's very painterly. It's very painterly in that, like exactly what you said. People are not contriving to reproduce a photograph.
Right.
They are painting, and they want it to look like a painting when it's finished. They don't want it to look like a photograph. So there is a definite now of course there are oil painters and acrylic painters that also are very painterly, and